this whole approach to eating and living, we look at something that is very, very fundamental and a question that's asked all over the world. What is the meaning of life? Right? We hear moms and pops asking these questions, philosophers, theologians, everyone is trying to figure out what is the purpose of life. And when we look at ancient Christian tradition, we see a concept known as theosis. And the definition, in a short way, to kind of examine this, is basically we are called, as humans, to be partaking in the divine nature. All God wants to do with us is to celebrate and be with Him, be in constant communion with Him. And I think about this, and we read the quote from St. Athanasius, God became man so that men might become gods. And we read this, we're like, oh my gosh, wow, what an overwhelming task, right? We are called to be in this divine nature all the time. And so interestingly enough, when we see that God wants us to partake in Him, we have to think what we're doing on a daily basis, right? And what's something that we do every single day? What's something we do every single day? We eat, thank God we eat every single day. So we're eating every single day. So how is eating and caring for our health there to help us attain what our purpose in life is? And that is to be in communion with God. So there's a lot of things to be said about this. But before we enter anything, we have to look at the spirit that we're entering it in. And so we see this teaching from St. Maximus the Confessor. In all our deeds, God looks at the intention, whether we do it for His sake or for the sake of some other intention. Do not think about or do anything without a spiritual purpose, whereby it is done for God. For if you travel without purpose, you shall labor in vain. And I don't know if any of you can agree in this room, but I feel like the nutrition bomb has gone off, right? Sometimes when my husband and I meet people for the first time, I'm like, I don't want them to know I work in nutrition. I just don't want them to know that. Because I know for the rest of the time, that's where the conversation's going to be. The carb diet, the cabbage diet, the fasting diet, low-fat diet. It's overwhelming. And so no matter what, we're trying to enjoy a glass of wine, a meal. It all is around, I shouldn't be eating this, right? I shouldn't be drinking this, right? So we are all always having our wheels turning when it comes to eating. And so I think this teaches us that first and foremost, we have to make sure we're keeping eating in the right spirit. So there's two ends of this spectrum. And in the medical arena, they just coined a term known as Orthorexia Nervosa. And basically what this means is an obsession with correct and healthy eating. And we see this all the time, right? People want to know everything about every single thing they're putting in their body. And again, that's a good thing. But if it's taken too extreme, we have to worry and be concerned with, is food becoming an idol in our life? Is health and wellness becoming an idol in our life? And so we want to keep it in correct balance. The other end of it is that we see it all the time. I was driving down the freeway to get here, and I'm so distracted by these billboards. And, the cups are this big, the portions are this big. So we can also go to the other extreme of really not caring what we're putting in our body or how much we're putting in our body. And so, interestingly enough, when we look at a healthy relationship with food and eating, and cooking for that matter, God has to be the center of it. Just like Cynthia was mentioning, it all comes back to the spiritual component of it being the center. And so if we are choosing to cook and eat and live a healthy lifestyle, but we're doing it for the glory of God, St. Paul teaches us, whether we eat or drink or whatever we do, it should be done for the glory of God. If we're taking care of our health to glorify God, if our goal of caring for our health is to move us closer to being in communion with God or attaining theosis, communicating with the divine, communing with the divine, if we care for our body to care for body and soul alike, then things are in their right place. And then what happens? We're caring for body and soul alike, and oh, by the way, my blood sugar becomes managed. I'm caring for body and soul alike, and oh, by the way, my cholesterol comes into its proper amounts. caring for body and soul like I lose 16 pounds. So we are first and foremost going to keep everything in its proper spirit. And that leads us to decide, well, then what's for dinner, right? If we're really going to do this and we're putting God first, then what's for dinner? This is great because Holy Tradition has basically told us how to eat. And you know, people ask me this all the time in my profession. They say, Rita, I want you to give me a list, a menu of what to eat, how much to eat. I want all the foods outlined. And I simply have to tell them, you know, I am not sure if I'm the right dietitian for you. Because we all have different food preferences. We're all eating in different scenarios. We don't even know what we're having for lunch, right? So if you have this rigid menu, sometimes it's just not going to work. So we need more basic principles to do that. Now, I have the blessing for working in my secular work for a company called Mediterranean Wellness. And we teach people, essentially, the Mediterranean philosophies of eating and living to care for their health and wellness. But again, we don't focus so much on the specifics of you have to eat in this rigid manner. It's more of the philosophies that are working to keep that culture healthy. Now, ancient Christian tradition tells us what days we're supposed to be eating what. And so when we wake up on a Wednesday morning, Wednesdays and Fridays have traditionally been set as what is known as fasting days in the Orthodox tradition. And so our food choices are different. Basically, we're eating a very, very basic diet. Fruits, vegetables, the building blocks of our diet, nuts, whole grains, seeds. That's pretty much it, right? And so when we wake up that morning, we already know how we're eating for the day. And so I encourage people to look at the ancient Christian tradition way of eating and follow the liturgical calendar as a guide. Because we just had Pascha take place. And so we celebrated our Lord's resurrection. And leading up to the event, we were fasting. And so to properly feast, we need to fast. And the ancient Christian tradition outlines that for us. Now, as Cynthia was mentioning just a few moments ago, there is just this buzz of fasting, 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 fasting everywhere, right? In fact, Princess Kate, right before she was going to get married, she wanted to lose a little bit of weight to have her dress fit nice and be in these pictures, and she did what is known as the fast diet. Now, interestingly enough, this diet is essentially just based on how ancient tradition has ancient Christian tradition has taught us to eat. So when 2 days are not side by side, so for us a Wednesday and a Friday, we pretty much have about one meal a day. So for women are encouraged to eat about 500 calories a day, and men are encouraged to eat about 600 calories a day. Interestingly enough, Dr. Michael Mosley, in the foreword of his book, he mentions that Orthodox Christians have been fasting forever. And it's right in the front. What he failed to mention was, and this is exactly how they have been fasting forever. Or if they're properly fasting, this is what it should look like. Okay? So when we fast, it's not necessarily just eating the quote-unquote fasting-approved foods. But the thing is to really eat less. The research shows it over and over and over again to extend quality of life, to lengthen the lifespan. When there's calorie restriction taking place, that occurs over and over and over again. You see this in lots of different studies from rats to humans. In fact, there was just a recent study that came out that looked at a 3-day fast, 72-hour fast. And they noticed that it was almost like hitting the reset button for the immune system of the body. And many other things that take place. Even they show that it benefits memory to go on different fasting periods. This book I highly recommend because it teaches the nuts and bolts of what that looks like when you're really trying to do calorie restriction. Unfortunately, I do a whole seminar just on fasting, so we can't really touch upon that today. But the idea here is that when we're trying to figure out how to cook to glorify God, how to eat to glorify God, fasting should be a part of that. Now, as we continue on, what we notice is that what we should cook becomes an issue. Because as Cynthia was saying, there's so much information out there today. And she's been learning so much of the things that we should be eating to properly prevent chronic diseases and care for our health and manage the chronic diseases that we have going on. So, St. Simeon, the new theologian, around the 10th century, teaches us many illnesses are frequently caused by a disorderly and irregular diet. You know, sometimes I'm sitting in these, nutrition meetings, and there's all this new research, and I sit there, and I just want to burst out and say, we already know this. Our saints and our tradition has taught us what we need to do to really care for health. So when we look at that, when we look at a disorderly and irregular diet, what does that mean for us? One thing we need to recognize is that we need to eat foods that fortify us. I truly believe if Saint Seraphim of Sarov was not supposed to be such a big part of ancient Christian tradition as a saint, he was supposed to be a nutritionist. Because this guy has taught us more about how to eat healthfully than really all the different scientific articles and studies I read. Every day one should partake of just enough food to permit the body being fortified to be a friend and helper to the soul in performing the virtues. Otherwise, with the body exhausted, the soul may also weaken. And so the take-home message here is that food fortifies us. God in his wisdom allowed humans to have a relationship with his creation, with his earth. And to really simplify this process, we just need to eat foods that God made. Now I can finish my presentation. Thank you for attending. That's it. Simply put, we need to eat foods that God made. But we're living in a culture where food is so confusing, right? We pick up something, and by definition, if we can open it up and put it in our mouths, we define it as a food. Can everyone agree with me on that? I always tell people, if you're in a grocery store and you're trying to put something in your cart that's not a food, people say, oh, you could put a greeting card in your cart. You could put toilet paper in your cart. And I'm like, well, what about diet soda? And people are like, yeah, you could put that in your cart. That's food. But the thing is that we now have a very bent perception of what's food and what's not food. And so everyone hold up your thumb. You're going to get your new rule of thumb. This is your new shopping buddy, right? You can't leave this at home. This is going to the store with you. So this is your new shopping buddy. And so you can put down your thumbs now. I hope that's thumbs up. I like the presentation so far. Okay, but here we go. We spend so much time looking at the fats and the carbs and the protein. We've made eating into a story problem. And you can ask my mom. She's sitting back there. Math was one of my worst subjects on the planet. So I don't want eating to be a story problem. My supervisor that I work with, he had to live in France for a period of time. And he was so intrigued. He said, because everything we do here, everything we try not to do here, they do there in France. They eat the butters, the creams, the wines, the chocolates, the cheeses. But we're told not to have that. So he was like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to go there and eat? So he said he would talk to his coworkers, how do you know what to eat? And he said, these people would look at me like I had 3 heads. Like, what do you mean, how do I know what to eat? My mom brings me food and I eat it. Why is this so hard for you Americans? And I thought that made so much sense. And then I started to think about my upbringing. And my mom just cooked her traditional ways of cooking. And so she just used real ingredients because that's what she had in her culture. Now we see 10,000 new food products every day on our shelves. And so our rule of thumb is going to teach us how to return to the basics. So we're going to turn our food label upside down. We're not going to worry about the fats and the carbs and the protein. We're going to handle all that because, unfortunately, you got to see me again come the afternoon. So we're going to handle all that, okay? But now what we want to focus on is the ingredient list. And if this list is longer than your thumb, right, and you can't pronounce half the things on it, it sounds like you're eating a chemistry project versus something that came from a garden. Probably shouldn't be eating it. A very basic way to look at this is that our body has a very ancient relationship with God's creation. And so our body knows how to process foods that come from God's creation. Our body has never seen magnesium oxide, or it has never seen artificial color yellow 6 and yellow 5. It's never seen aspartame. It's never seen aspartame, but it's seen honey that bees give us. It sees sugar cane that grow in the fields. It sees maple syrup that's been tapped from trees. So we have to return to the basics. And so in your program materials, I give you a starter list. And so I really encourage you to start to look at this list and remove these fake ingredients from your diet. People start to realize, wow, I'm satisfied with less as a result of that. And so what I want to do quickly is I want to show a very powerful video, and then we'll look at some more foods. But this is to show you that we have to recognize that if our purpose in life is to attain theosis with God, if this is our purpose, do you think the demons want this for us? No. They're going to be attacking that much harder. And what is one of the best kept secret tools of the evil one? Deception, right? Very deceiving ways. And I really believe that this has happened. In fact, St. Paisios, which I'll share a quote with you in a few minutes, has said that so many things have changed in our food culture that it's such a deceiving way to make things that otherwise would be seen as a health food very dangerous. And so I want to give one example, and then I'll show the video. Like I said, I wish I could have you here till 6 p.m. So when we look at something like butter, okay, God gave us cows, cows gave us butter. But then we look at something like margarine, okay? Again, I hold up my thumb. Whoa, that's a long one. And I read it. Liquid and partially hydrogenated soybean oil, vegetable and monoglycerides, sodium benzoate, which actually has been shown to increase asthma attacks in asthmatics, potassium sorbate, which is being very questioned right now as a possible cancer-causing agent, artificial flavor. Does this sound like something you're just rushing to put on your wonderful morning piece of toast? So the thing, though, is that during the era of the Depression, when butter was really, really expensive, someone, a scientist, decided he was going to help feed the nation for a cheap price. And so he went into a lab, and through a chemical reaction, he took a liquid oil at room temperature, and he heated it, and he started adding hydrogen bonds through this process until it became solidified. And then voila, margarine was born. People that even lived in the era of the Depression remember receiving a little packet of food coloring that you were supposed to mix in to make it look like butter. Now it's already in there for you, so you don't have to mix it in. They saved you on that. But the thing is for so long, what have we been hearing? Health care professionals have been telling us margarine's better than butter, margarine's better than butter, margarine's better than butter. Now they're like, oops, we made a mistake, right? Butter is actually better than margarine. Now again, portion control is key, but that's the next portion that we'll discuss. So, but look, deceiving stuff, right? So it's kind of the work of the evil one, just slyly getting into something that can affect our health. And when our health is affected, it can affect many different areas of our life. You know, they say when someone's hungry, feed them so that you can help them with prayer. You know, if you're always, oh, I'm so hungry, it's very hard to focus on anything. And so we help people meet their basic needs to get them there. But when we're making our own food choices, we have to recognize that this choice is not fortifying us. St. Seraphim of Sarah would say, choose the butter, right? It fortifies. So we're going to look at a portion of a 60-minute video. And they went into the biggest flavor industry in the world. And this flavor industry is called Givaudan. And I don't actually need to say anything else. The videotape's going to speak for itself. And then we can look at some other foods and have a discussion about this too. So let me just get this started.
As the Thanksgiving weekend comes to a close, you may feel as overstuffed as that turkey you ate. And if you're overweight, and the chances are you are, it's probably because you eat too much of the wrong stuff. Most of the wrong stuff we eat comes in a bottle, a can, or a box, food that's been processed. Much of that food has been flavored. The flavoring industry is the enabler of the food processing business, which depends on it to create a craving for everything from soda pop to chicken soup. It is Willy Wonka and his chocolate factory as a multi-billion-dollar industry, an industry cloaked in secrecy. But recently, Givaudan, the largest flavoring company in the world, allowed us in to see them work their magic.
The story will continue in a moment.
So definitely an aroma. The mandarin, dancing tangerine. Real mild though, not in your face.
These are super sniffers, super tasters.
And more bitter.
On the prowl, the special forces, first responders to the call for the next best taste.
The mandarin notes are fantastic.
Yeah.
They're braving the wilds of a citrus grove in Riverside, California, where Jim Hassel, whose nose and palate are legendary, leads a Givaudan team on a taste safari. Big game hunters in search of the next great taste in soft drinks. Their inspiration, the greatest flavorist of them all, Mother Nature.
Seeing everything that's available really just drives the whole creative process.
Like an artist going to Rome or something.
Correct, correct.
But the ultimate purpose is to sell more soft drinks or whatever.
That's what we're in the business of. Selling flavors.
Let's go sniffing. Our perception of taste is largely located in the nose, but described in the language of music.
Do you get like a tropical note, a little bit of papaya, potentially?
Yeah, cotton candy note.
Cotton candy a little bit.
They're plotting how to move the flavors they find in this grove to your supermarket shelf, and then on to your stomach.
I can see it in a sports drink. I can see it in a water, flavored water. And I also could see it in a twist on an orange carbonated beverage.
When they find something they like, they extract its flavor molecules from the fruit on the tree. Then back in the lab, they mimic Mother Nature's molecules with chemicals. Essentially what you do is you take whatever this smells like and copy it.
Right, exactly.
And then I suppose you could, if you choose to, you could quote-unquote improve on it.
Exactly.
Yes, we all the time.
The holy grail, a flavor so good you can't resist it.
In our fruit flavors, we're talking about we want, a burst in the beginning and maybe a finish that doesn't linger too much so that you want more of it.
And you don't want a long linger because you're not going to eat more of it if it lingers.
Ah, so it's going to be a quick fix. And then
Have more.
And then have more. But that suggests something else.
Exactly.
Which is called addiction.
Exactly.
You're trying to create an addictive taste.
It's a good word.
Or something that they want to go back for again and again.
Food companies know that flavor is what makes repeat customers. So they commissioned Givaudan.
I was like, after I watched this, I was like, oh, Givaudan, you probably shouldn't have let them in. Because the word's out, right? What these companies are doing is trying to create food addiction. And so when we are eating foods that contain artificial flavor, that contain aspartame, and we're beating ourselves up because we feel like we have such a hard time with portion control, we have to first and foremost realize that it could start with the food choices that we're making. So research is showing over and over and over again, aspartame is leading to people eating more. It's interesting because we're eating a sugar, a fake sugar, that is 200 times sweeter than sugar. 200 times sweeter. So God's made something and we're like, you know what? I think God actually meant this to be 200 times sweeter. So let's alter it a bit, right? But so what we're doing is we're kind of setting ourselves up to fall. And so first and foremost, we eat food. And so some things that were otherwise seem okay might not be the best choices. Now, when we look at Coffee Mate, right? We see all these different things dancing across the front, fat-free, 0 grams of trans fat, so on and so forth. But again, the ingredient list is the most important part. And we see corn syrup solids, partially hydrogenated, coconut or palm kernel. I love that. They're like, we're not actually sure what we put in it, so we'll say. And then dipotassium phosphate. It goes on and on and on. And then when you look at something just like half and half, we look at milk and we look at cream. 2 things that, again, come from a cow. And later on, we're going to hear Marcia speaking a little bit more about our choices in that area, which that's good because those are also important. But again, if we're trying to choose a diet soda because we're trying to keep our calories under control, it's way more than just calories in and calories out. When we're caring for our health, we already heard Cynthia mention, we're going to hear it again, stress is an important component, managing our stress. So it's way more than calories in, calories out. So again, diet soda. You read the ingredients. If you see them on the starter list I gave you, it's not a choice. And if you're interested in some substitutes for soda or just some other drink options, I have a email list. And please put your name on the list because I didn't want to kill too many trees. And I have a list of other resources that I'd like to send out, and I usually do it in the email format. And also, because we're not talking too much about fasting today, but if you're interested in this fasting cookbook, I can send it to you in the PDF format too. And so I'll put the email list back there, and you can take a look at it after the session. So it gives you some examples of some fasting meals that are whole food based. Okay, now, not to sound negative, because things are starting to change. And your buying power is really making a difference, okay? Now, again, this is not a fruit. This is not a substitute for a fruit. But we see kids having these all the time, okay? This is the Welch's brand. The family farmer-owned is on the front and everything. So the front of the label is where they can market the food as much as they want. Anything can be on the front. On the ingredient list is where they have to fess up and be honest, okay? So when we look at this, we notice artificial flavors. So thank you, Jivadon. And we see red dye 40, yellow 5, blue dye 1. Food dyes, artificial food dyes, believe it or not, are petroleum-based. The stuff that we put in our car to make it go vroom vroom is also in our foods, okay? Now, interestingly enough, in Europe, they've made such a strong correlation with the consumption of food dyes in children and hyperactivity disorder that they've taken them out. They're just no longer able to be used. And so if you import something from Europe, you notice that they're using natural food dyes. They're starting to take a look at this in nutrition policy in the States, to just finally get rid of them and go back to using just natural ways to dye food. But we're not there yet. So until we're there, the important thing to do is use our ingredient list. But this is just to show you, this is the Costco version of this fruit snack. And they're dyeing it with, let's see, they're using the coloring from carrots, blueberries, sweet potato, cherries, and radishes to dye it. So things are starting to change, and your buying power really does make a difference. And so, yes, we all are working with food budgets. But again, what we might have to pay a little bit more in food now is going to help us with preventing the need for medication. And also, when we get to the second portion, and we talk about portion control, you're going to realize if you're controlling portions and you're spending a little extra money, the food actually still lasts longer. So in the end, it's a lot cheaper. And again, there's a whole other session on eating on a budget and so on and so forth. Now, Cynthia briefly mentioned the studies showing the effects of what some of these foods do to our children when we take them out. Briefly, I'd like to show you another study, and this was done with a school in Australia. And they looked at school-aged children, and they decided to go ahead and take all the additives and preservatives out. The reason I kind of feel like this is such a powerful video is not necessarily what the adults are saying, but what the children themselves are saying they're noticing when they're eating an additive-free diet. So we'll just take a quick peek at this.
Is that your drink? Whose drink is that? Okay, can I have a look at the drink?
And cheese and bulk as well.
Right, so that's got a colour in it. Colour 110, that's an artificial colour.
Food detective and nutrition author Sue Dengate thinks she can find the answer to most kids' problems here, in their lunchboxes. You might need to be a food scientist to decode the information, but these children are walking test tubes.
It's really bad.
In the past few decades, hundreds of additives have crept into their food. Colours, flavours, preservatives. At least 60 of them cause problems for some kids. But which additives affect which kids? Food companies are leaving parents to find out that for themselves. And the results have been disastrous.
The authorities have really dropped the ball when it comes to protecting our children.
Over the next 2 weeks, these children from Nana Glen Primary School in New South Wales will be cutting the additives from their food. They have a list of nasties to avoid, and for any 6-year-old, it's quite a mouthful. Sorbates, benzoates, nitrates, glutamates. Sometimes they're words, sometimes numbers. Always in the fine print and hard to find unless you know what to look for. Their parents have been armed with the same information, and the canteen will only serve food with natural ingredients.
What food aren't you going to eat now?
I can't eat colours, preservatives and flavours.
The effects of a food intolerance can be subtle. The child who fidgets, the child who can't concentrate, the child who has no friends.
They were pretty good in the classroom, but they really seem to be playing up now.
Is it my imagination or are they louder since they've been eating lunch? And this is what you expect. And I think next time we're here, you'll see they're quieter and calmer.
It's been 2 weeks since the children of Nana Glen went additive free. We've come back to see if it's actually made any difference at all.
Okay, you guys, hurry up.
First stop, the principal's office. Laurie Renshaw had to ask teachers, students and parents to cooperate, and he was stunned by the result.
Just as an example, this year we've averaged 6 students on detention per week. Over this last week, we haven't had 1 student on detention. That speaks volumes for itself.
I can see a...
So, onto the classrooms to see the results firsthand. Kindergarten teacher Jenny Wiseman.
They listen to instructions better and they're not so impulsive. I think that's probably the biggest change that I've seen, that they think before they do things, think before they act.
Okay, we're going to put that on the stove?
Yep.
Parents also couldn't believe the most seemingly benign foods could be having such a detrimental effect on their child's behaviour. Helen Barrett found out her son Liam reacted to additive 160B, found in vanilla ice cream and yoghurt. Removing it from his diet changed his life.
His behaviour improved, the tantrums stopped, the head banging stopped, and basically we've gone from strength to strength from there. It's basically changed our life because now I don't spend my whole day with a child that says no every time I ask him to do something. I have a child that I enjoy being with, and he's just a beautiful, unique creature.
Most tellingly is what the kids say themselves.
I was getting more friends because I wasn't being so mean as I used to be.
I've been sleeping much better because before I used to, when my mum and dad talked to me, and I'd always, take a while to go to sleep. But now when my mum and dad puts me to bed, I go straight to sleep. People used to leave me out because I used to get really angry, and now they're playing with me and all that.
Behaviour isn't the only thing affected. There are physical symptoms as well. There were less incidences of bedwetting, headaches, stomach aches and skin rashes. In fact, 60% of children who appeared to have nothing wrong with them are better behaved on an additive-free diet.
Nothing but positive feedback. Are you surprised?
You might remember, I told you so. We've seen this so many times before. You take a lovely school.
So, again, this stuff, we're not making it up. We don't love nutrition that much that we just decided to come up with this stuff. This is really how it is. And it's simplified for us because now what we hear in all of the medical arena is that we have to control chronic inflammation in the body. Chronic inflammation, chronic inflammation, chronic inflammation. And we're seeing that chronic inflammation is related to a whole host of diseases. Like Cynthia mentioned, 95% of these are preventable. But it comes down to controlling this inflammation that we see in the body. And so when we are ingesting a lot of foods that our body doesn't have a relationship with, and the body doesn't know how to process, it's going to cause inflammation in the body. And so when we see St. Paisios, he's teaching us, today people make illicit and deceitful businesses. However, they should not falsify food substances because they become the cause of harming people's health. And so we see this happening. But this doesn't mean we have to eat a diet that's very bland and plain and so on and so forth. It just means we have to read the ingredients. So the first word I learned was ice cream, according to my parents. And so I really enjoy ice cream. It is a treat food. But again, is ice cream something I should be having every day? We all know this answer, right? And we're going to talk about it again a bit more when we talk about food control. But when I do choose an ice cream, I want to make sure that it's made up of foods that are coming from God's creation. So cream, milk, sugar, egg yolks, vanilla. Sound like a real food? Okay, so we can still have these treat foods. It's all about control. Now, we're seeing many food companies getting on board and starting to remove a lot of these additives and preservatives from the foods. This is just a package of salami, okay? And we see pork, and then we see salt, a little bit of sugar, contains less than 2% of spices, and that's it. So they've taken out the sodium nitrate and nitrite, okay? Obviously, we have to look at health, that we have to do as much as we can. If we're slaughtering all our own cows and pigs and we have a farm, this is obviously the best. But if we're looking at the building blocks of our diet really being plant-based and fruits and vegetables, and then every once in a while we're incorporating meats into our diet, that's a fine thing to do. But again, it's all about the balance and the ones we choose. So if we're choosing the salamis, we want it to be free of the nitrates and nitrites. These have been they're being very highly researched right now as possibly being cancer-causing agents. They're put in our foods to give them a shelf life of forever, and they're supposed to be a flavor enhancer. Last time I checked, I didn't need my meat the flavor enhanced. So again, it all comes down to choosing the clean food ingredients. This is just almonds. And guess what the ingredients are? Almonds! So that makes it an okay food. You can go buy some smoked almonds, though, and monosodium glutamate is one of the main ingredients in it. So you always have to do a comparison and say which one has less. So when we're cooking in a way to glorify God, when we're eating in a way to glorify God, we first and foremost start with foods that He created. Okay, we've also made eating and cooking very confusing because we look at all the different products out there and there's fat-free, low-fat, this and that. If you go to France and you want to buy milk, you go to France and you buy milk. There is not the green cap, the blue cap, the rainbow cap, the orange cap. There's not all these different fat-free, low-fat, skim-free, all this sort of thing. They just have milk. Milk, just how it came from the cow. And when we look at this, you know, God in His wisdom had fat in dairy, probably for some greater reason than we're ever aware of. And interestingly enough, when we look at dairy in our culture, we're the culture that eats the most amount of low-fat and fat-free dairy products, okay? And we're the culture that has the highest amount of dietary-induced lactose intolerance. Now, in other cultures, we see lactose intolerance, but it's more due to genetic composition, okay? But we see such a high relationship with dietary-induced lactose intolerance. Now, I've never done actual scientific research on this per se, but I can tell you I've seen hundreds of people that tell me that they're lactose intolerant, and I say, you know, okay, lactose intolerance is not a life-threatening condition. Why don't you try to go back to having full-fat dairy, and let's see what happens. And so this is my theory, but I've seen it actually work, so I'll share it with you. 1 cup of skim milk, okay, has the same amount of calories as a half a cup of whole milk. Same amount. 1 cup of skim milk, half a cup of whole milk. Same amount of calories. But when you're drinking 1 cup of skim milk, you're drinking twice the amount of lactose sugar, just because the portion size is bigger, okay? When you're having a half a cup of whole milk, you've decreased the lactose sugar in half. In our bodies, we have what is known as lactase enzymes, and these enzymes work to break down lactose sugar, okay? So when we're drinking that skim milk, drinking it, all this lactose sugar gets dumped to my lactase enzymes, and they're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And they start working real hard, and then people get these symptoms that are associated with lactose intolerance that are uncomfortable. Some people experience feeling bloated, other people get constipation, diarrhea, nausea, headache, all sorts of symptoms. But when you're having the dairy with the fat intact, a little bit of lactose is released at a longer period of time because the fat has to be broken down. Fat is broken down very slowly in the body. And we live in a culture that is so scared of fat. We hide from fat, right? But again, fat can work in our favor. I always tell people, fat is our friend. It's all about how we have it. Fat, because it's processed very slowly in the body, can help to keep you sustained between meals. So it helps in decreasing between meal snacking. If a person is diabetic and they have fat incorporated into their meals, they notice more of a sustained blood sugar rise than peaks and lows, okay? But again, it all comes down to amount, which we're gonna talk about later. So the thing is that because a little bit of fat can go a long way, if you add, and we're not gonna start counting calories, but if you add 30 calories in the form of a fat to your breakfast, it can help to prevent a 200-calorie mid-morning snack. And again, that's because of the way fat is processed and it keeps us satisfied. One of the main reasons we're seeing all that inflammation occur that I just showed you on the last slide is because we're eating too much. And we're a culture that wakes up and has breakfast, and then we have a snack, and then we have lunch, and then we have a snack, and then we have dinner, and we snack. But when we look at healthier cultures, when we look at Japan, when we look at the Mediterranean region, snacking is something that just doesn't exist. And they're still having the white rice and the baguettes. But again, they're having this much. Whereas we can go to a sub shop and get a 12-inch sub. I mean, the sub's bigger than our head. You know, you'd never see that much bread being served at a place in France. Japan, they're still eating white rice, right? You're not going to take their white rice away from them when they're enjoying their sashimi. But they have this much. Here we get 2 scoops, and that's for the small, right? You can usually supersize it and get, another extra scoop. Even if we're ordering brown rice and we're still having that much, it's way too much for the body. And when we're intaking way more than our body's needs, triglycerides go up. And we see inflammation occurring. So we'll talk about portion control in a bit. Now, let's see how much time. I'm a sucker for these videos. And I have one more that's going to really bring to life this whole dairy thing. And then I just want to show you a couple examples in regards to fat in the diet and how it can help to keep us healthy, help keep our blood sugar in check, help us to manage our weight. Health can come at any size. We all come in different shapes, sizes, cultures. This is a beautiful thing, ethnicities. But it's all about making sure we're doing the right things for our body. So giving our body the foods it needs and eating them in the correct amounts. Okay, so let's watch this one last video because, again, I saw it and it made me laugh, so.
Andy's been investigating the milk industry, and it's not as pure as he'd like.
The milk we get from cows has always had a special standing among the foods we eat. Mothers are always saying to kids, drink your milk. So what in the world have they done to this simple and basic food? I bet a calf wouldn't drink most of the stuff called milk in these cartons here. You can't tell some of it from Diet Coke. The companies that sell milk are upset because people are drinking less milk than they used to, and they don't know why. Has it ever occurred to them that people aren't drinking it because milk isn't as good as it used to be? These all came out of the milk section of a grocery store. Low-fat milk, fat-free milk, 2% reduced fat milk, skim milk. Before milk was homogenized, that's mixing the cream in with the milk, cream came to the top of your milk bottle. If they took the cream off the top, they skimmed it off. What this ought to be called is not skim milk, but skimmed milk. Saturated fats are bad for our arteries, we all know that. But do you know how much fat milk has in it as it comes from a cow? Well, about 3.2%. So 2% is no big reduction. I like half and half on my shredded wheat. But when I say half and half, I mean half milk and half cream. I bought this the other day, and I didn't like the taste, so I looked at the label to see what it was half of and what the other half was. Listen to these ingredients. Non-fat milk, milk, corn syrup solids, artificial color, sugar, dipotassium phosphate, sodium citrate, monodiglycerides, carrageenan, natural and artificial flavors, vitamin A palmitate. This is half and half, not half anything I want. It has nothing to do with something as good as milk. This is 3.2%. They call it whole milk. Well, why don't they just call it milk? Some of this other stuff tastes more like whole water. They all like to use the words farm or dairy on their cartons. This comes from Farmland Dairies in Wallington, New Jersey. We went to Wallington looking for a dairy farm. The address was 520 Main Avenue. This is the farm. No cow in sight here. My suggestion, if they want to sell more milk, is that they go back to selling what comes out of a cow.
I'm Leslie Stahl. We'll be back next week with another edition of 60 Minutes.
Okay, so we've just seen foods change over time, right? And nowhere, in any period of time have we been drinking more milk than we're drinking now. And, the thing is when you look at cultures that are healthy, they don't drink as much milk as we do here. They eat their dairy. So they eat yogurt, they eat cheese. Again, it's okay to have dairy, but again, it all comes down to amount and the choices that we make. But I did want to utilize this to segue into sugar real quick. Because can everyone agree with me that fat makes food taste good? Right? Yeah, that's right. I put some butter on my toast in the morning. That is a happy piece of toast, right? Just having a piece of toast by itself, not doing much. So again, when we go through fasting periods, we feel this sort of hunger, which is an important part of fasting. Now, interestingly, when a company decides to take the fat out of a food, they have to put something else in there to make it taste half decent, right? And what do you think they're putting in there? Sugar. Exactly. Also, fat has a natural palatability to food. So if they're taking the fat out of the food, different additives and preservatives and stabilizers go in to give it some sort of consistency. Another thing that is added a lot of extra times is salt. So when we look at fat, we don't want to run from it. In fact, Dr. Paul Rosen, he does a lot of research in the area of food and people's relationship with food. And he said, you know, fat is actually viewed as a dietary toxin in our culture. People think eating large amounts of low-calorie foods is better than just having small amounts of high-calorie foods. But in the end, what has been shown is when people are trying to do low-fat, fat-free, low-fat, fat-free, they feel hungrier more frequently, so they snack more frequently, or they eat more at an actual meal setting. So they're actually eating more calories come the end of the day versus the person that just has fat in their foods. And I was blown away when I saw this example. So back to my friend, the coffee mate, right? Actually, my nemesis, but look at this. In 1 tablespoon, there's 30 calories. And fat-free is dancing across the front and everything. In half and half, which again is half milk and half cream, there is 17 calories. So there is twice the amount of calories in the fat-free product versus the full-fat product. So at the end of the day, who's eating more calories? Now, another thing to keep in mind is that even if we're choosing something that's organic and natural and so on and so forth, the sugar bomb has gone off in our culture. I mean, it's just everywhere. Sugar is everywhere. So something as basic as yogurt, just plain yogurt. When you buy the maple version, and this is a brown cow, good quality, no growth hormone, all this sort of thing, in this 6-ounce container of yogurt, okay, believe it or not, there are 3 teaspoons of sugar. Do you think if you took your own plain yogurt, you're going to sit there and put 1, 2, 3 teaspoons of sugar in here to sweeten it? No. And the thing is because it's full fat, we don't even need to eat this whole container. Usually, people get away with having half the container, maybe throwing in some slices of banana, maybe a pinch of cinnamon, maybe just a tiny drizzle of maple syrup or honey, some walnuts, boom, breakfast is done. Kids feel like they're having dessert for breakfast, it's great. But when we buy something that's already sweetened, when we tell a company, sweeten this for us, they're always going to put in more because they're responding to the American taste buds. And right now, our taste for sugar is just to the moon. So the World Health Organization just came out with a recent statement, and they said people should be having no more than 6 added teaspoons of sugar a day. And I read that and I thought, wow, that's actually quite generous. Added teaspoons, that means the sugar that we're adding to our yogurt or the honey that we're adding to our tea. This doesn't refer to the sugars that are naturally found in milk or the sugars that are naturally found in fruit. This is added. And I thought, my goodness, 6 added teaspoons of sugar a day. If you have 1 can of soda, you're over for the day. You've had your 10 teaspoons of sugar. Okay? In this bag of Skittles, I do work with children that already have fatty liver at the age of 7. They already have diabetes at the age of 7. And they were coming to my classes with these in their back pocket. And I said, you come here. Give me that. So I got it out of their back pocket, and I said, let me see this. So I went and calculated it for them. And in this bag of Skittles, believe it or not to mention the food dyes and everything else, there's 22.5 teaspoons of sugar. That's the amount of sugar a child is eating when they're eating this bag of Skittles. I took this amount of sugar, and I was able to make a dozen peanut butter cookies, right? Actually, over a dozen. There were like 14. So I came back to the class. I gave each a cookie. And I said, from now on, instead of this, we're going to do this. So when we are looking at sugar being consumed in this amount, the body must view it as a toxin. When we're having a little bit of honey in our tea, that's not a big deal. When we're having a little bit of brown sugar in our yogurt, not a big deal. If we're having a short piece of shortbread every once in a while for lunch, not a big deal. So if you sign up for the resource guide, I put together a list of how easy it is to stay under the amount of allotted sugar for the day and how easy it is to go over. Now, our goal is to always try to stay under as much as possible. But if you want that resource guide, just please sign up for the list. Okay? So no matter what, whatever we're having, we have to watch the amount. Now, these sodas, now they're starting to make them with sugar, which is a good thing. They're going back to the way things used to be at soda parlors. But again, still too much. This whole bottle has about 16 teaspoons in one serving, okay? And so even though it says sugar and you're like, oh, but Rita said sugar's okay, it's all about amount, okay? So that's what we want to be aware of. So what are we going to do? We are simply going to try to eat like the apostles ate. So back when the apostles were around, eggs were around. Back when the apostles were around, bread was around. These foods are okay. It's all about the amounts. Now, we can go to a restaurant in America and eat a 32-ounce steak and get our picture taken and our picture on the wall, right? Do you think when the apostles sat down to eat meat, they were able to eat 32 ounces per person? No. And so if we think that meat is being produced differently, it really is in relation to how much one person is trying to eat at a setting. So that all goes hand in hand. So fake sugars were not an option for the apostles. They ate the real deal. They had less. And so we look at the Psalms for guidance. He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle and herb for the service of man, that he may bring food out of the earth and wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. So when we look at eating and cooking, we want to make sure that it is a joyful time. When we gather to eat and commune together, the beauty of it is that it's not just feeding the machine. We are actually doing something so much more beyond just the macronutrients that we're putting in our body. This is a time to create peace and respite in our day, to commune with the divine. So eating is a time to be in communion with God. And so I came across this quote on a blog, and I was really affected by it. And the cook from a monastery mentioned, we always try to have a balanced, nutritious, and tasty meal so that people do not waste their time trying to eat or dream about food. And it goes back exactly to what Cynthia was saying. This doesn't mean we have to only eat celery sticks. We can enjoy food, but it has to be in proper balance. And in fact, it has to taste good, or we're going to want that 10 a.m. snack. So there is a whole psychology to eating. Now, that also takes us into cooking, because we really wanted to focus this session too on glorifying God through our cooking practice. And I came across a monastery cookbook, and it said that cooking is an art and a service to others. And I was so affected when I read that, because again, we're looking at it so much bigger than just something else we have to do in our day. This is a way to serve others, but also to serve ourselves. Because if we're nurturing ourselves, if we're taking care of ourselves, it again allows us to take care of body and soul alike, and those elevate to God together to attain theosis. Now, I always tell people, an apron is a magical thing. You put an apron on and you enter a kitchen, it changes the whole dynamic of what's taking place. And so you start to recognize that cooking really is an art in itself. And so right now, if cooking is a stressor in your life, I'm hoping some of the strategies that I gave you on the handouts that are in the back can help it to be more of a de-stressor. Just some simple things that you can do to make it be more of a de-stressor. And so when we're going to cook, we're going to make sure that we're cooking in balance. And so the building blocks of every meal always have to be fruits and vegetables. And it's funny, you know, many of us just finished fasting, and you know, we're eating a lot of vegetables, a lot of beans, I'm like, I don't want to see one more bean for a long time. But when the Pascha feast came along, I'm like, oh, those vegetables look really good. It was a salad, and the salad looked really good. So it's almost like you always want vegetables to be there. And so we're going to talk about eating in balance, and that means that we can have anything as long as it's a real food. But it's also about the balance in which ways we have that food. And there's some tips for you in your program materials, and we'll talk about that a bit more come the next session. So we're going to look at eating out. Not all the time, but sometimes. Back to the way it used to be. When you're eating out, you don't know what they're putting in your food, right? But when you're cooking, you know what goes into it. And so now when you don't eat out as frequently, you choose places that you know are using quality ingredients. If you're eating out all the time, you're probably choosing cheaper places that probably are using a little bit, you know, not as good quality ingredients. Okay, we're going to use canned foods. Not all the time, but some of the time. And there's going to be a discussion about BPA and things of that nature. But again, when we read the back of a canned food, we just simply want to make sure that the ingredients are clean. These just say Beans, water, salt. Okay, I think that can come home with me. Now, the salt has already been added to the can for me. So that's why it's important to practice the art of cooking. You taste as you go. It might not need any extra salt because there was salt in the can. So cans some of the time, not all the time. Having a special drink, such as a glass of lemonade. Again, you want to make sure maybe the glass of lemonade is made with honey. But this is a drink that is a treat drink. Some of the time, not all the time. I always tell people, think about soda parlors. Soda parlors weren't the standard thing that we did every day. It was an event, right? But now, soda is the standard drink that we get at virtually any meal that we sit down. And again, I'll give you some replacements for sodas if you'd like that. Okay, so what are we going to do with our cooking then? First and foremost, we go back to the teaching of St. Paul. And anything that we do should be to the glory of God. And we are encouraged to pray without ceasing. And from spending time at a monastery cooking with the nuns, this is one thing I've learned. You know, when you're cooking, you should be praying. And if you're not praying, you probably shouldn't be cooking. So it all goes hand in hand, right? So when we want to think about, oh, goodness, I don't feel like cooking tonight. But if we say, oh, but this is going to be a time for me to pray, and, you know, I didn't have really some quality prayer time the rest of the day, it almost makes it that more inviting. Now, these are just some things to help you find your helpers. Because sometimes if we don't know how to cook, or we haven't been in the kitchen for a long time, we need some techniques to help us get back in there. How many of you use a pressure cooker? Okay, so you know that this can cut the cooking time of things virtually in less than half. It's a great way to make dried beans, you know, whereas on the stovetop they might take an hour and a half. In a pressure cooker, you can have them done in 12 to 18 minutes. So might be something you want to put on your wish list. And again, I always tell people, get the very basic one. You don't need all these fancy gadgets because then, you know, if it just goes back and forth, then you know when it's safe to open and not open. Grilling vegetables. Now with the weather changing, you know, taking advantage of using the grill, and a lot of times just that flavor and adding that to a salad or a fast side dish can be wonderful. Blender, you can do anything from smoothies to cream-based soups, and a lot of times, you know, when you have a blender, you can make stuff and freeze it and then add the cream in at the end and things of that nature. A slow cooker. They always say it's your chef when you're away from home. So if you've always wanted a personal chef, buy a slow cooker. The slow cooker will cook for you when you're away. You know, taking advantage of the freezer, again, a lot of times, if you don't have a lot of time, but you know this week is a little less busy than next week, make extra and freeze it. It's going to make your next week all the more helpful. Bread, a lot of times people, when they start to look at the ingredients, they're scared now of like all this stuff that's in their bread. Like, I just thought bread was flour, yeast, salt, water. What's all this other stuff, right? Actually, I made a little bet with my friend. He had a loaf of, I don't know what the brand was, but I looked at the ingredients and I said, I bet in a month later there will not be a speck of mold on this bread. And he laughed at me. He said, no way. And I said, yes way. And so we made the bet. A month later, not only was there not a speck of mold on the bread, you could go like this, whoop, and it was still nice and fluffy and soft. So this stuff is being put in our foods to keep it longer, but what is it doing to our health, right? So some people have chosen to buy a bread maker because you just throw the stuff in there, it makes it, there you go. Okay, choose foods that do not require cooking. Lots of fruits and veggies are ready to lend themselves to help you out in that area. Another thing that I really think is so beneficial is cooking in stages. And I always tell people to look at their exercise in this way too. You know, you don't have to do something for like an hour straight and get your heart rate this high. Again, exercise doesn't have to be a story problem, as Cynthia showed with the blue zones. But we need to look at cooking in the same way. So if you know you're going to be using onions and tomatoes in the dinner tomorrow night, and you're using onions in tonight's dinner, just chop a couple extra, put them in the fridge, and then when you come home from work, you feel like you're on a cooking show. You know, everything's kind of chopped. But if you come home and you're like, oh goodness, I gotta chop the onions, I gotta chop the tomatoes, I gotta, you know, rip the salad. So cooking in stages as much as possible is helpful. Even if you just whip up the dry ingredients and store it for later for maybe something you're going to make. So try to think about that as much as possible. Also, finding a cooking buddy. A lot of people have said this has been such a good ticket for them. In your church community, in your neighborhood, in your work, you tell someone, okay, I'm going to make some soup and I'm going to bring you half. And then Tuesday, they're going to do the same. So that could be 1 or 2 days less that you have to cook because you cooked extra and shared and vice versa. So people are starting to try to set these clubs up even more, just so it takes the burden off having to cook every single day. Take your Saturday and plan for the week, and have others partake in the meal selection. So many head of the households that are like kind of the gatekeepers of the food that come in and decide what's made, they said, you know, Rita, I actually don't mind cooking. What is hard for me is thinking about what to cook. I just sometimes like, oh, what am I going to make tonight? So if you have the family participate in a menu, then you just look and you're like, oh, okay, we're going to do taco salads. At least I know what to buy now. Okay, and then finally, clean as you go. I have to admit, this is something that my husband taught me, because when I used to cook, I guess, it was like a bomb went off. And he's like, how on earth are there bowls up there? And like, you know, why did you use 12 different measuring cups? And so he really has taught me to clean as I go. And it really makes a difference, because now when you sit down to the table, dinner's ready, but a lot of the cleaning has already been done. And I always tell people, too, it's a nice way to sneak in your exercise. So if you stand and try to watch the water boil, it's not going to boil faster. Believe me, I've tried it. But if you go into the other room and you do a set of sit-ups and you come back in, the water's boiling. So cooking can also be a time to really care for your body and soul, because you're caring for your health in the way of fitting in short bursts of exercise. Okay, briefly, I just wanted to mention that in the program, the fasting cookbook that I can email you, this is a guide for stocking your pantry for fasting periods. And so I just wanted to briefly let you know that that would be coming through email, since we're not talking too much about fasting today. And then also we want to keep it simple. And this is related to fasting. And so when we're fasting, we're spending less time cooking, so we have more time for prayer. Less time cooking, so we have more time to attend the services. Less time cooking, so that we have more time to spend doing some sort of almsgiving. And so these are just some suggestions on how to keep fasting simple. Bishop John used to tell me, you know, Rita, you make a pot of soup and you eat it for the week. And then it's easy. You know, you make a pot of lentil soup, by the end of the week you're sick of it, but glory be to God, at least you have food on your table, right? And it just helps in the fasting, because you're like, I really don't want to eat this again, so you end up eating less. So there you have it. It actually does work. All right. And actually, I did come across another teaching. This was on a blog, and a father wrote, do not let the cure for the passions become the passion. And so a lot of times, I think we're doing that with health in general. We're trying so hard to be overly healthy, which is, yes, the cure for maybe the passion of overeating or not giving in to snacking and so on and so forth, but then it actually becomes a passion. And that's the whole concept of making sure that food is kept in its proper context, and lifestyle and health is kept in its proper context, that it doesn't become an idol in our lives. So that's all for this section, and